All right, everybody. I hope your brain has recovered from the morning and you're ready. You got some spare neurons. I'm saying nonsense if the neuroscientist is listening, but we're going to get started with our afternoon. Greg Stevens, who joined us originally as our executive champion when he ran a large chunk of the ADAS program for Ford, and now in his second, more illustrious career with Mcity. Greg is going to talk a bit about how safe is safe enough for AVs. We've talked a bit about this. We had a panel on this last year at our 60th, Mcity 60th anniversary from the policy side. But what does it really mean? What do we have to put out there? You've seen papers from Waymo. They are always conspicuously missing the key social questions, the data that you would want in terms of making that determination. So Greg's gonna take a crack at it. Greg, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Yeah, I'm actually gonna sort of basically set up the context for all the presentations that'll happen after me this afternoon, sort of, around this idea of AV safety, right? Because people are continuously coming to us saying, are AVs safe? And I say, well, there's a question you got to answer before I can answer that question, which is, how safe is actually safe enough, right? What is good enough? And should that be decided by corporations? Like, should that be individual AV companies deciding that on their own? Or does there need to be a societal consensus on this? And so to sort of tee up this idea of it being a societal consensus, I wanted to do a thought experiment with all of us, right? So let's remember that today about 40,000 people die every year on roadway accidents. And that's a tremendous, tremendous tragedy, right? And so now let's cast our minds forward into a future where AVs are now pervasive. And let's think about two potential headlines that could exist in that future state. One is that autonomous vehicles reduce fatalities by 90%, saving 36,000 lives every year in the United States. I mean, think about that, right? That's just amazing. That's transformational. 36,000 people who are alive who wouldn't have been if AVs hadn't become pervasive, right? So we all want to live in this future, but what might be something that could keep us from getting there, right? Which is another potential headline that could exist at the same time in this future, right? Because I told you about the 90%. What about the 10%, right? So AI robots kill 4,000 people per year in the US, and because they're AI robots and they're black boxes, no one can explain why, right? So society reading that headline might go, wait, well, hold on, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that, right? And if they make that decision that they're not comfortable with that, and that leads us to not roll out AVs as fast as humanly possible, then we don't get the benefit that's in the top right there. And so, that's really why I think this needs to be a societal discussion. And that's something we're committed to here at Mcity. And so who wants to know, right? Who are the people asking this question, how safe is safe enough? Well, the general public wants to know, right? They want to know, is it safe for me to book a robotaxi ride? They want to know, is it safe for me to step out in a crosswalk in front of an AV? Public safety advocates need to know what they should advocate for and against. Regulators need to issue permits saying that this robotaxi service is okay to work in my city, right? So they need to know how safe is safe enough. In the event of accidents, judges and juries need to assess fault and liability. Insurance companies need to underwrite risk. The AV companies themselves want to have standards to work to, right? Because in the event of accidents, it's very nice to be able to say that you're in compliance with the industry norms. Mobility providers like Uber and Lyft, if they put an AV in their fleet, they need to know, what the safety performance of that service will be. And thank you, Greg, appreciate it. And investors need to know because, AVs right now are not profitable. it's being run on investor money. And so investors need to know, is this a place we should continue investing in? And so everybody wants, this zero risk environment that's, at the lower right. But let's face it, as soon as you put a foot out of bed this morning, you took a risk, right? I mean, there's no such thing as zero risk, right? And so really what we need to go for is what's in the top left there, which is absence of unreasonable risk. And that's not a well-defined statement, right? That's a very subjective term. So who decides, right? Well, there's multiple sort of framework models that people think of. And, the regulatory framework, people sort of often talk about this good cop or bad cop. And if you talk to like innovators, they'll say, regulation's always a bad cop, right? It constrains my ability to innovate. It slows me down. It gets in my way. And so, they'll say, we really don't want the bad cop. We want no cop, right? Which is basically what it is today, right? It's the AV companies get to decide on their own how good is good enough, how safe is safe enough. But I would argue that no cop is a false state. It doesn't really exist, right? Because no cop, in the event of an accident, becomes a litigation cop, right? It goes to a jury of your peers, and a jury of your peers then decides whether the engineers at that company made a good decision or a bad decision. And juries of your peers deciding, the goodness of engineering is not really the best process, right? So the other thing that no cop becomes is 50 cops, right? Because every state needs to figure out individually what they're going to do. And so, you end up with this patchwork of permitting authorities in different states and different cities. And it's just an administrative nightmare for the AV companies, right? So this idea of no cop, is really a false choice. That's not a good state. So we got to go for good cop, right? That's what we need to create. And that's really what we're going to be talking about. Doing nothing is not an option. And so, what does this look like? What eventually, when we have this, this good cop framework, what would they be judging? What would the good cop be looking at? And I think basically it'll be a safety case. All the AV companies today are making safety cases, but they're proprietary, they're closed, they're internal, they never get really sort of actively reviewed or debated. And so we need to sort of maybe think about how could we make parts of this safety case more public so that we could generate a societal consensus. And so when people ask me sort of the framework I have in my head for a safety case, this is the one I've developed over the years because in my mind, there's really two pillars of a safety case. One is on the left side there, you have to design in safety. Safety has to be done by design first. And that's what on the systems engineering V, that's what the left-hand side is. And then you need to prove that the designs you made are in fact really safe in the real world. And that's what safety validation is, the right-hand side. And, at Mcity, we're going to be going after the safety validation side. But let me just sort of, get into a little more detail on this as a framework. So on the left-hand side, safety by design, basically what that means is you got to design the operational design domain for your autonomous vehicle. And so that means what streets does it work on? What weather conditions does it work in? What speeds does it go? What are the boundaries? And then you need to define the intended function, and that's safety of the intended function, which is SOTIF, where you say, what are all the things that could go wrong and how do I make countermeasures to guard against those? And then you need to look at malfunctions, which is in functional safety. And so, okay, when things don't work properly, how do we put in countermeasures to protect against those hazards? How do we protect cybersecurity? How do we protect privacy? How do we build this all into a robust architecture? On the right-hand side, the part that we're going to get heavily involved in on the safety validation side, you want to go through these things, which I'll talk a lot more about in this next slide, which is a safety validation framework. So the main thing we're all interested in is we want to avoid injuries. And injury risk has multiple components. One component is how well does your AV stay out of bad situations? How good a defensive driver is your AV? Another one is you can't avoid all conflicts because the world is chaotic, right? So when conflicts occur, how well does the AV handle it? And then, finally, crashes will happen. The chaos of the world sort of dictates that crashes will happen. But how severe are the injuries from the crashes, right? And if AVs created crashes that were on average less severe than the ones humans create, that would also be a safety benefit. So those three things are important areas for us to assess in our validation framework. And so then we'll look at specific competencies. Like the first one for staying out of conflicts is how good a defensive driver is the AV? How well does it comply with rules? So these are the driving 101 things. Don't tailgate, don't drive in blind spots, make complete stops at stop signs. This is where AVs actually really shine, right? AVs are always vigilant. They don't text, they don't get distracted, they don't drive impaired. They can see 360 degrees around them at all times. They can see better at night than we do, right? So this staying out of conflicts is really where AVs shine. Then when we talk about when conflicts occur, there's common critical ones that we all know about and see every day, and then there's the edge cases. The common critical ones, these are the ones that would be sort of, extreme versions of what you would see on, say, a driver's test, right? Where you do car following, but what if the person in front of you slams on their brakes really hard? Or what if a jaywalking pedestrian runs into the street? And then there's the edge cases. These are the ones that are novel situations, the sort of once in a blue moon ones. So somebody runs a red light. Does your AV handle that scenario, even though they know they had a green light? A child runs out chasing a ball, or, pop-up snowstorms like we have in Michigan, where you go from, a really nice day to a whiteout snowstorm within a period of 10 minutes, right? And how does this get judged, right? Right now, we judge it subjectively. We say, that AV got too close to me. That AV scared me. That AV reacted too late, or it was too aggressive. It braked too hard, or it was too conservative. It started braking too early and it stopped too short. So these are the subjective terms, but we've got to turn these into actual objective measures, and we've got to have actual pass-fail levels on each of the metrics, right? So it's not just the AV shall handle this situation, but the AV will achieve this level of a metric or better, right? We need to be very, very clear about that. And so the course of the talks for this afternoon will cover adversarial testing that Haowei and Jun-Gao will handle. Digital twins, Darian and Itai will handle that one. Winter driving, Zach Asher will handle that. And Wenbo Sun will talk to us about injury risks. And then Ken and Carol will talk about metrics and thresholds. And FA and Carol will talk about deployment monitoring. And so this is my last slide. Basically, these are the goals for what we're creating in our AV safety assessment. We want it to be clearly defined. We want a public statement of how good is good enough, how safe is safe enough. And we don't think that we're going to get it right on the first try. But I think it's important for us to put a stake in the ground and say, here's what we think, and then use that to foment a debate, right, about what is right or what is wrong, right? Somebody's got to go first. Somebody's got to create the straw man proposal, and we're going to do that. Needs to be transparent. We're not, viewing this as like our own field that we will own. This is open source, fully inspectable. It needs to be a nationwide debate. We think there needs to be unbiasedness, right? Capitalism, if people are self-assessing, the profit motive can create biases. And it needs to be endorsed. So that group of stakeholders that I showed on the slide of who wants to know how safe is safe enough, they all need to be part of this discussion. And so with that, I will open it to questions.
When we talk about how safe is safe, have the courts started weighing in on that stuff, or U.S. Department of Transportation or anything like that at all? What's their stance so far?
Right now, there is not a lot of detailed guidance, right? It's sort of high level guidance. You can voluntarily submit your safety case, things like that, but there's no sort of assessment of it, of is it good enough? And it's all very private, right? It's not public. And so there's no way to actually answer that, you know, how safe is this particular AV system at this point?
Okay. I was just curious if there anything had been done in that space. So it doesn't sound like there has been yet.
They've clearly identified it as a need. It's a need that we intend to fill.
Hey, Greg, are you going to work with any third-party entities that like are over the standards of any kind of?
We are absolutely open to working with anyone and everyone. I want to make this as broad a coalition as we can. You know, we had a symposium, you know, where we had State Farm on our panel and Uber was on our panel and, you know, Consumer Reports as one of the leading, you know, public safety advocates was on our panel, right? And I think, you know, that's sort of a broad coalition, as well as, you know, I talked a lot about safety validation, but there's the auditing of design safety, where there's an entire industry that does those kind of audits right now, right? So I think that needs to be part of this process as well. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.